Chapter 15. A Pirate Steals a Visit Home. A few minutes later, Tom was in the water, wading towards the shore. By the time the water came up to his middle, he was halfway over, and when the water began to get too deep for wading, he started to swim. He reached the shore finally and put himself on the bank. Tom put his hand on his jacket pocket and found the piece of bark safe that he wrote the note on, and then started through the woods, following the shore towards the village. Shortly before 10 o'clock, he came upon into the open near the town and saw the steamboat next to the high bank. Everything was quiet under the stars. He crept down the bank, watching carefully, slipped into the water and swam 3 or 4 strokes and climbed into the little boat tied to the end of the steamboat. He hid under the side of the boat and waited, panting. Presently the steamboat bell rang, and the voice gave the order to cast off, and in a minute or two the little boat began to be pulled by the steamboat across the river towards the village. Tom felt happy in his success, for he knew it was the boat's last trip of the night, and in about 15 minutes the steamboat slowed down, and Tom slipped into the water and swam ashore below the landing so that no one could see him. He flew along the deserted alleys and shortly found himself at his aunt's back fence. He climbed over it and looked into the sitting room window, for a light was on. There sat Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and Joe Harper's mother talking. Tom went into the door and began softly to lift the latch. Then he pressed gently, and the door opened a crack. Between the group Tom was a couch. He squeezed through the door and under the couch just in time, as Aunt Polly said, "Why, the door's open, I believe. Why, of course is it? Sid, go along and shut it." Tom, under the couch, could almost touch his aunt's foot. She continued, "But as I was saying, he wasn't bad, so bad, just full of life, like a colt. He never meant any harm, and he was the best-hearted boy that ever was." She began to cry. "It was just so with my Joe," said Mrs. Harper, "always full of the devil and up to tricks, but he was the kind as could be, and bless me to think I whipped him for taking the cream, and I remember later I threw it out because it was sour. And to think I will never see him again in the world, never, never, never." Mrs. Harper sobbed into her heart till it broke. "I hope Tom's better off where he is," said Sid, "but if he'd been better in some ways—" "Sid!" Aunt Polly glared at him. "Not another word against Tom, now that he's gone. Oh, Mrs. Harper, I don't know what to give him up. He was such a comfort to me." "Really? Tom was a comfort? I don't know about that." She went on talking. Mrs. Harper found many more things to feel sorry about for Joe, and Tom could hear Mary crying and putting in a kind word now and again for him. And he felt like rushing out from under the couch and showing himself, but this was too much fun. So he lay still. He went on listening and found out that everybody guessed that the boys had drowned while taking a swim or using the raft, since the raft was found 5 or 6 miles below the village. It was believed that the boys had gone down in the deep water, and since the bodies could not be found, if the bodies could not be found and were missing until Sunday, all hope would be given up and the funeral would be preached on that morning. Tom shuddered. Mrs. Harper gave a sobbing goodbye and then had another good cry before she left. Aunt Polly was very tender to Sid and Mary, and they went to bed. Sid sniffed a bit, and Mary went off crying with all of her heart. Then Aunt Polly knelt down and prayed for Tom before she was thought. Tom was crying too, but he stayed under the couch until she went to bed. At last, when Tom felt sure Aunt Polly was asleep, he stole into her room to look at her. His heart was full of pity for her, and he took out his note on the bark and placed it by the candle. But then he changed his mind and put the bark back in his pocket and bent over and kissed Aunt Polly and quietly went, closing the door behind him so he didn't leave the note for Aunt Polly. Tom made his way back to the boat landing, found nobody there, and untied the little boat from the steamship, slipped into it, and soon was rowing upstream and across the river. He soon landed on the other side for a while, and he thought of capturing the boat as a pirate should, but he knew that they would be looking for it and maybe find their pirate camp. So he stepped ashore and entered the woods. He sat down a long time to keep awake and then started back to camp. The night was nearly over before he found himself near the island. He waited until sunup and then swam to across to camp. A little later, was close enough to hear the other pirates, to hear Joe say, "No, Tom's true blue, Huck. He'll come back. He won't desert. He knows that would be a disgrace to a pirate. Tom's too proud for that. He's up for something or other. I wonder what." "Well, the thing is, these are ours anyway, aren't they?" "Pretty near, but not yet, Huck. The writing said that if he isn't back by breakfast—" "Which he is!" exclaimed Tom, stepping importantly into camp. A wonderful breakfast of bacon and fish was soon made, and the boys set to work upon it. Tom told about his trip, and they were a proud company of heroes when the story was over. Then Tom hid himself in the shade to sleep till noon, while the other pirates got ready to fish and explore. Oh, he knows what he could do. He could totally save them all from crying, but nope, he loves that people are crying over him.